The Prince, by Wayne Rebhorn, statesman, political theorist, Republican essayist, historian, biographer, poet, and dramatist. Niccolò di Bernardo de Machiavelli was born May 3, 1469, in the city of Florence, during an era of political upheaval on the Italian peninsula. The Machiavelli family had held numerous positions in the Florentine government, but Niccolò's father was not wealthy and could not give his son access to Florence's most powerful families. Little is known of Niccolò's youth, save that he studied Latin and the classics, including Livy's History of the Roman Republic. In 1494, the Medici family, which had controlled the politics of Florence for a century, was driven out of the city, and the Florentine Republic was established, heavily influenced by the monk Girolamo Savonarola, who preached against tyranny and corruption. When the Savonarola regime collapsed in 1498, Machiavelli was installed in the newly elected city government. He was appointed head of the Second Chancery, was secretary to the governing council that directed foreign affairs and defense, and exercised influence in his unofficial role as counselor to the head of the government, Piero Soderini. Machiavelli served for 14 years in these powerful political and diplomatic positions, which allowed him to experience the behind-the-scenes world of European politics, including missions to the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, King Louis XII of France, Cesare Borgia, who was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and Julius II, who followed Alexander as Pope, and his observations profoundly influenced his political philosophy. Machiavelli's work for the Florentine Republic awakened him to the challenges facing the Italian city-states, and his later writings reflect his keen desire to rescue Italy from its subjection to foreign powers because of its fractionalism. Machiavelli's fortunes changed in 1512 when Spain invaded Italy and dismantled the Republic of Florence. The Medici family reclaimed power, promptly dismissed Machiavelli. In early 1513, Machiavelli was imprisoned and tortured on charges of conspiracy against the Medici. He maintained his innocence and was pardoned on the condition that he withdraw to his villa in Percusina, 7 miles outside the city. It was there, cut off from Florence's political milieu, that he wrote The Prince, as well as his other enduring political works, The Art of War and Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy. In a matter of months following Machiavelli's release from prison, The Prince was an effort to secure the future stability of Italy, and especially Florence, through unsentimental, pragmatic, and strategic statecraft, and to gain the trust of the Medici, which would allow Machiavelli to return to public life. But this was not to be. Although he was eventually given a relatively small political office by the Medici, he never regained the important political position he had held in the Republic. Moreover, the 2 successive Medici princes to whom the Prince was dedicated died before Machiavelli's hopes could be realized, and of his political works, only The Art of War was published in his lifetime. Machiavelli was an active member of the Ordi Aurisolari intellectual circle, and he continued to write on a wide range of subjects during the remaining 14 years of his life. He wrote the popular comedy The Mandrake Root in 1518, and a biography, The Life of Castruccio Castracani, in 1520. In that same year, Machiavelli succeeded in regaining the favor of the Medici. He was given a commission to write the history of Florence, which he completed in 1525. Before his death, the lifelong Republican saw the fall of the Medici and the return of the Florentine Republic in 1527, although officials refused to restore him to his old political position because of his association with the Medici. Niccolò Machiavelli died in Florence on June 21, 1527. The World of Niccolò Machiavelli and the Prince. In 1453, Constantinople falls to the Turks, who begin their relentless spread, which will last some 300 years, into the Balkans and Central Europe. Greek scholars flee to Italy, with important manuscripts, enhancing the study of Greek and the printing of Greek texts. In 1469, Niccolò Machiavelli is born on May 3rd, the third of 4 children of Bernardo Machiavelli, an impecunious lawyer, and Bartolomea Nelli, an educated woman who writes poetry. By 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the banner of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, travels to the New World. Ferdinand succeeds in expelling the Moors from their last stronghold in Granada in southern Spain. In Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, dies. His family had controlled Florentine politics for the past century. Well-educated and himself a poet, Lorenzo patronized artists such as Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, and Michelangelo, and scholars and writers such as Angelo Poliziano and Marsilio Ficino. In 1494, the French king, Charles VIII, invited into Italy by the Venetians, who wished to extend their territory in Lombardy, invades the Peninsula in order to claim the Kingdom of Naples. Lorenzo de' Medici's son Piero and the rest of the Medici family are driven out of Florence, and the Republic is established. The charismatic Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola, the head of the convent of San Marco, becomes the spiritual leader of the city. In 1495, Charles VIII captures Naples and partitions it with the Spanish king, Ferdinand of Aragon, but is soon thereafter driven out of Italy. By 1498, excommunicated by Pope Alexander VI, Savonarola is brought to trial by the Signoria, the governing body of Florence, and after being tortured, is condemned to death and is burned at the stake together with 2 of his disciples. On June 19th, Machiavelli is made head of the Second Chancery, which is primarily concerned with foreign affairs. In 1499, the French king, Louis XII, invades Italy and occupies Milan and Genoa. In 1501, Machiavelli marries Marietta Corsini. He will have 4 sons and a daughter with her. In 1502, Piero Soderini is made the Gonfaloniere Vita, chief magistrate for life of the Florentine Republic. Machiavelli is sent on several diplomatic missions to Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. In 1503, Pope Alexander VI dies and is succeeded for a short time by Pius III and then by Giuliano della Rovere, an enemy of the Borgias, who takes the name Julius II. In 1504, Machiavelli writes his Decennale Primo, the first decade, a history in verse of the first 10 years of the Florentine Republic. Louis XII signs the Treaty of Blois, by which he retains Milan and Genoa, while the Spanish get Naples in 1505. In 1507, Machiavelli goes on a diplomatic mission to the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, passing through the German-speaking areas of Switzerland on his way to Austria. In 1508, Pope Julius II forms the League of Cambrai against Venice with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Machiavelli writes his Rapporto Dellicos della Magna, Report on German Affairs, based on what he had observed in Switzerland and Austria. In 1509, the League of Cambrai defeats the Venetians at the Battle of Agnadello, Vaila. The Florentine citizen militia, which Machiavelli argued for, retakes the rebellious city of Pisa. Machiavelli writes the Decennale Secondo, the second decade, but work on it is interrupted, and it is never completed. In 1510, Pope Julius II forms the Holy League against France with Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, and England. Machiavelli is sent on a diplomatic mission to France in a futile attempt to persuade the French to allow Florence to remain neutral in its struggle with the papacy in Spain. In 1512, the French win the Battle of Ravenna, but lose their best captain, Gaston de Foix, and are later driven from Milan by the Swiss. A Spanish army marches on Florence, where partisans of the Medici take the Palazzo della Signoria on September 16th and restore the Medici to power. Machiavelli loses his position as head of the Second Chancery on November 7th. 3 days later, he is exiled from Florence but refused permission to leave Florentine territory. He begins an 8-year exile from the city on his farm at Sant'Andrea in Percusina, near the town of San Casciano. In 1513, the French are routed by the Swiss at the Battle of Novara and withdraw from the Peninsula. Machiavelli's name is found on a list of conspirators against the Medici. He is arrested on February 12 and tortured, but is released on March 11th, when a general amnesty is proclaimed to celebrate the election of Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo X. Machiavelli begins the writing of the Discourses and begins and possibly completes that of Il Principe, the Prince. In 1515, the French king, Francis I, invades Italy, and with his Venetian allies defeats the Swiss at the Battle of Marignano. Thomas More begins writing Utopia, which he will finish the following year. Machiavelli begins taking part in conversations in the important philosophical, political, and literary center called the Orti Auricellari in the gardens of the Palace of Cosimo Rucellai. In 1516, Desiderius Erasmus publishes The Education of a Christian Prince. When Giuliano de' Medici dies, Machiavelli dedicates the prince to Lorenzo de' Medici instead. In 1517, Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, an event that marks the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. In 1518, Machiavelli completes the Discourses and, most likely, writes his original play, the comedy La Mandragola, the Mandrake Root. In 1519, La Mandragola is published in Florence. It will be published in Venice in 1522 and in Rome in 1524. The Spanish King Charles I is elected Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V in 1520. In March, a meeting is arranged between Machiavelli and Giulio de' Medici. After a trip to Lucca in July, Machiavelli writes La Vita di Castruccio Castracani da Lucca, the life of Castruccio Castracani of Lucca. On November 8, Giulio has a studio, Fiorentino, the University of Florence, appoint Machiavelli, the official historiographer of the city. Machiavelli probably writes his one story, Belfagor, Arcidiavolo, the archdevil Belfagor. In 1521, Machiavelli publishes his Arte della Guerra, the Art of War, a dialogue that is set in the Orti Auricellari. He is sent to the town of Carpi to negotiate the separation of the Minorite convents from the other convents in Tuscany. In 1523, Giulio de' Medici is elected Pope as Clement VII. In 1524, Machiavelli writes the comedy Clizia, a play that is a free reworking of Plautus's Cassina. It is produced the following January. In 1525, Francis I once again invades Italy and is decisively beaten at Pavia, where he is captured, taken to Spain, and the next year forced to sign the Treaty of Madrid, by which he renounces his claims to Italy and ceded Burgundy to Charles V. Machiavelli completes the History Fiorentine, History of Florence, and presents it to the Pope. He writes the Discorso o Dialogo intorno alla nostra lingua, discourse or dialogue on our language. In 1526, Francis I repudiates the Treaty of Madrid and forms the League of Cognac with Clement VII, Henry VIII of England, Florence, and Venice against Charles V. Machiavelli is made secretary to the commission in charge of the fortification of the walls of Florence. In 1527, Charles V sends an army under Charles de Bourbon to attack Rome, which is brutally sacked for a week in May. Florence throws out the Medici and re-establishes the Republic. Machiavelli is refused an office in the new government. He dies on June 21st. In 1529, the French are defeated by the forces of Charles V and sign the Treaty of Cambrai. Renouncing their claims in Italy, however, they will return to Italy several more times in the next 2 decades. In 1531, The Prince and the Life of Castruccio Castracani are published together by Blado in Rome. The Discourses is also published there by Blado. Finally, in 1559, the Treaty of Cato Cambrasis, by which France yields Milan and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to Spain, marks the definitive expulsion of France from Italy and completes Spain's domination of the peninsula. Introduction by Tim Parks. Necessity, must, have to, inevitably, bound to. These are the words that recur insistently throughout The Prince, and then again success, victory, prestige, achievement, and, on the other hand, loss, failure, defeat, death. These opposites are linked together by an almost obsessive use of because, so that, hence therefore, as a result, as a consequence. From start to finish, we have a vision of man maneuvering precariously in a suffocating net of cause and effect. What is at stake is survival. Anything extra is luxury. The Prince was written by a 44-year-old diplomat facing ruin. After 14 years of influence and prestige, a change of regime had led to his dismissal. Suspected of conspiring against the new government, he was imprisoned and tortured. The rapid reversal of fortunes could not have been more devastating. Found innocent and released, he left town to live with his wife and family on a small farm. For a worldly man and compulsive womanizer, used to being at the frenetic heart of public life, this too felt like punishment. Idle and bitter, he tramped the hills by day, and in the long, empty evenings, began to write down some considerations on how to win power, and, above all, how to hold on to it, how not to be a victim of circumstance. The result was a slim volume that would be a scandal for centuries. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. The same year Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, came to power. First male child after 2 daughters, Niccolò would grow up very close to his father, Bernardo, an ex-lawyer, mostly unemployed, with good contacts but no significant wealth or influence. If the son was to rise in the world, and he was determined to do so, he would have to count on his own wits and charm. Niccolò's younger brother, Toto, chose not to compete and went into the priesthood. The boy's mother, it should be said, was an extremely devout woman, a writer of religious poems and hymns. Their father, on the other hand, was skeptical, more at home with the sober works of Latin antiquity than the Bible. Niccolò may have taken his writing skills from his mother, but over divisions on religion he stood with his father and the Roman historians. One says of Lorenzo il Magnifico that he came to power, but officially Florence was a republic, and since Lorenzo was only 20 years old in 1469, he was far too young to hold elected office. An explanation is required. When in the 13th century, the Florentines had thrown out the noble families who used to run the town, they introduced a republican constitution of exemplary idealism. A government of 8 priori led by one gonfaloniere or prime minister would be elected every 2 months by drawing tags from a series of bags containing the names of well-to-do men from different guilds in different areas of town. This lottery would allow each major profession in each geographical area to be adequately and constantly represented. Every individual of a certain social standing could expect a brief share of power in order that no one could ever seize it permanently. The system was unworkable. Every 2 months a new government might take a different position on key issues. The potential for instability more or less obliged whichever family was in the ascendant to step in and impose continuity. From 1434 on, the Medicis, first Cosimo, then Piero, then Lorenzo, had been manipulating the electoral process to make sure that most of the names in the bags were friendly to themselves, and that all of those actually selected for government would toe the Medici line. Hence, although the Florentines still liked to boast that they were free citizens who bowed the knee to no man, by the mid-15th century they were in fact living in something very close to a dictatorship. When the rival Pazzi family tried to assassinate Lorenzo in the Duomo in April 1478, it was because they saw no legitimate way of putting him in his place as an ordinary citizen. Machiavelli thus grew up in a society where the distance between how things were actually run and how they were described as being run could not have been greater. He was close to his 9th birthday when the captured Pazzi conspirators, one an archbishop, were hung upside down from the high windows of the city's main government building and left there for weeks to rot. He would have understood very young the price of getting it wrong in politics. The young Machiavelli might also have had reason to doubt that there was any meaningful difference between matters of religion and matters of state. The Pope had backed a Pazzi conspiracy, priests had been involved in the assassination attempt, and Lorenzo was excommunicated after it failed. The religious edict was a political tool. A war between Florence and Rome ensued, and the hostility only ended in 1480, when Turkish raids on the southern Italian coast prompted a rare moment of unity in the peninsula. Years later, Lorenzo would so ingratiate himself with the new pope as to get his son Giovanni made a cardinal at age 13. From excommunication to pope's favorite was quite a change of fortune, and once again it was more a matter of politics than of faith. Nothing, it appeared, was beyond the reach of wealth and astute negotiation. At this point, Machiavelli was 21. We know very little of his early adult life, but one thing he definitely did at least once was to listen to the fiery preacher Girolamo Savonarola, head of the influential monastery of San Marco. Savonarola's was a different kind of Christianity, rather than the corrupt, pleasure-conscious world of the papacy, whose decadence had offered no resistance to the rise of humanism. This austere monk represented an early manifestation of what we have come to call fundamentalism, a return to the biblical text as the sole authority on earth, and a vision of the church as embattled and defensive in a world increasingly interested in values that had little to do with the gospel story. With great conviction, Savonarola preached the virtues of poverty, advocated the burning of any book or work of art that was impure, and prophesied doom for the sinful Florentines in the form of a foreign invasion. In 1494 his prophecy came true. To get any grasp of Machiavelli's diplomatic career and the range of reference he draws on in The Prince, one must have some sense of the complicated political geography of Italy in the 15th and early 16th centuries, and of the profound change that occurred in the 1490s, a change that would determine Italy's fate for the next 350 years. For most of the 15th century there had been 5 major players in the peninsula: the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, Florence, Venice, and Milan. Extending from just south of Rome to the southernmost tip of Calabria, the Kingdom of Naples was by far the largest. Wedged in the center, with only precarious access to the sea, Florence was the smallest and weakest. All five powers were in fierce competition for whatever territory they could take. Having lost much of their overseas empire to the Turks, the Venetians were eager to expand inside the northern Italian plain, Ferrara, Verona, Brescia, and down the Adriatic coast, Forli, Rimini. Conscious of the size and power of a now unified France to the north, Milan hoped for gains to the south and west Genoa as a counterweight. Florence simply tried to get bigger in any way that was convenient. Over the previous century, the Florentines had captured Arezzo, Pisa, and Cortona, and wasted huge energies in a series of failed attempts to conquer Lucca. Rome's aim under any pope was always to expand north and east into Romagna and Emilia, with a view to swallowing up Perugia, Bologna, Rimini, and Forli, a project that would bring it into conflict with both Venice and Florence. In the far south, Naples was governed by a branch of the House of Aragon, but the crown was contested by the Angevin kings of France and by the Spanish royal family, also Aragons, which already ruled Sicily. So the scenario was complicated. Scattered between the large states were at least a score of smaller ones, some no bigger than a town and the surrounding fields, and all constantly under threat of invasion from one enemy or another. However, if the situation was rarely static, it is also true that there were few major changes. As soon as one power achieved some significant military victory, the others immediately formed an alliance against it to halt its progress. Florence, in particular, owed its continuing independence largely to the fact that if Venice, Milan, or Rome tried to take it, the other two would at once intervene to prevent this happening. Than 100 years a certain balance of power had been kept. All this ended with the French invasion of 1494. The invasion was, as Machiavelli himself explains in The Prince, largely the Italians' own fault. For some time the five states had been in the habit of frightening each other with the threat of foreign intervention. During the war against Rome and Naples in 1480, Florence had invited the French king to pursue his claim to the throne of Naples more actively. In 1482, during a Venetian assault on Ferrara, Florence and Milan had encouraged the Turks to step up their attacks on Venice's maritime possessions. Venice had replied by inviting the Duke of Orleans to pursue his claim to Milan. In a war against Naples in 1483, Pope Innocent VII had reminded the Duke of Lorraine that he too had a claim to the southern kingdom and invited him to send troops. There was an element of bluff and brinkmanship in these threats, but in 1494, when King Charles VIII of France accepted Milan's invitation to make good his claim to the crown of Naples, the bluff was called. Charles marched south with an army far larger than any Italians had seen in living memory. From that moment on, the peninsula would not be free from foreign intervention until the completion of the Risorgimento in 1870. Struggling to hold Naples, the French would invite in the Spanish from Sicily to split the kingdom with them, and the Spanish, after Charles I of Spain inherited the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, would eventually push France back north of the Alps, put Rome to the sack, and dominate Italy for 150 years. But that is to leap ahead. In 1494, when the French first marched through Lombardy heading for Naples, Florence was directly in their path and, what's more, an ally of Naples. At this point, Lorenzo il Magnifico had been dead for 2 years, and the Medici regime was led by his incompetent son Piero. So abject was Piero's capitulation to Charles, so spineless his decision simply to surrender the city's dependent territories, that the Florentines rebelled against him. The Medici regime collapsed, and very soon the preacher who had been prophesying this disaster was made Gonfaloniere, first minister, this time on a yearly rather than a 2-monthly basis. Girolamo Savonarola ruled Florence from 1494 to 1498, during which time the city passed from being one of the centers of Renaissance humanism to a book-burning fundamentalist theocracy. Realizing that Savonarola's claim to be God's prophet was a far greater threat to its authority than any humanism, skepticism, or eclecticism, the Church in Rome did everything possible to bring about his downfall, and in 1498, having lost much of his support in Florence, the preacher was convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. It was shortly after these dramatic events that Niccolò Machiavelli succeeded in getting himself elected to the important positions of Secretary of the Second Chancery, one of two key state departments in Florence, and soon afterwards, Secretary of the tug-of-war, a committee that dealt with foreign relations and war preparations. Machiavelli was 28. We have no idea how he arrived at such appointments at this early age. There is no record of any special experience that would warrant such confidence in his abilities. But within months he was traveling to neighboring states to represent Florence's interests, and over the next 14 years he would be involved in important, often long-drawn-out missions to the King of France, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, Cesare Borgia, Caterina Sforza, and many others. In between these missions he was frequently and very actively engaged in Florence's ongoing military campaign to retake Pisa, which had regained its independence during the French invasion. Pisa was crucial to Florentine commerce in that it gave the town an outlet to the sea. Introductions to the prince generally play down Machiavelli's abilities as a diplomat, presenting these years as useful only insofar as they offered him the material he would draw on for his writing after he had lost his position. Machiavelli would not have seen things that way. For more than a decade he was Florence's top diplomat, and proud to be so. And if the missions he undertook did not produce spectacular results, this was largely because he was representing the weakest of the main states in Italy in a period of particular confusion and vulnerability that would eventually see 4 foreign powers militarily involved in the Peninsula: France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and Switzerland. Savonarola had taken Florence towards an alliance with France. The priest's successors followed the same policy, but without any clear vision of how the city might achieve stability and security in the long term. To make matters worse, having decided in 1502 that their gonfaloniere, or first minister, should be elected for life, the Florentines gave the job to Piero Soderini, an honorable man but chronically incapable of making any kind of bold decision. Machiavelli's diplomatic career was thus mostly taken up in attempts to persuade surrounding and threatening states to leave Florence alone, and not to expect financial or military help from her for their wars elsewhere. That is, as far as there was a discernible long-term policy, it was one of prevarication. Far from home, Machiavelli would frequently receive contradictory orders after he had already started negotiating. Arriving in foreign towns, he would find that his expense allowance wasn't sufficient to pay couriers to take his messages back to Florence. Sometimes he could barely afford to feed and clothe himself. Such was the contempt of the more powerful monarchs that he was often obliged to wait days or even weeks before being granted an audience. It is in the light of these frustrations that we have to understand Machiavelli's growing obsession, very much in evidence in The Prince, with the formation of a citizen army. Florence was weak partly because of its size, but mostly because it had no military forces of its own. It relied on mercenary armies, which were notorious for evaporating when things got tough, before the gates of Pisa, for example. A power base, built on an efficient and patriotic civilian army, would give a diplomat like Machiavelli a little more clout and respect when he negotiated. Or so he hoped. In June of 1502, 4 years into the job, Machiavelli met Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, With his father's support, Borgia was carving out a new state for himself on the northern borders of the Papal States, and had just captured the city of Urbino to the east of Florence. Sent on a mission to dissuade Borgia from advancing into Florentine territory, Machiavelli was deeply impressed by the man. Seductive, determined, cunning, and ruthless, Borgia was a leader in the epic mode. Certainly he could hardly have been more different from the diplomat's dithering boss, Soderini. Machiavelli was on another mission to Borgia in January 1503, when the adventurer invited a group of rebels to negotiations in the coastal town of Senigallia, then had them seized and murdered as soon as they were inside the town walls. Here was a man, Machiavelli realized, determined to take circumstance by the scruff of the neck. It was not so much Borgia's willingness to ignore Christian principles that fascinated him, as his ability to assess a situation rapidly, make his calculations, then act decisively in whatever way would bring the desired result. This modern positivist attitude, where thought and analysis serve insofar as they produce decisive action rather than abstract concepts, lies at the heart of the prince. Meanwhile, Florence continued to drift. Machiavelli was once again on the scene in 1503, this time in Rome, when Borgia's empire collapsed after both he and his father fell seriously ill. Legend has it that Alexander had accidentally poisoned them both. The Pope died and the son lost his power base. 3 years later, Machiavelli was traveling with the later Pope Julius at the head of the papal army when Julius demanded admission to the town of Perugia, walked in with only a small bodyguard, and told the local tyrant, Giampaolo Baglioni, to get out or face certain defeat. Sure that Baglioni would simply kill Julius, Machiavelli was amazed when the man caved in and fled. Such were the Pope's coercive powers, as he then marched north to lay siege to Bologna, that Florence was once again forced to enter an alliance and a war in which it had no desire to be involved. As Secretary of the Ten of War, Machiavelli enjoyed just one moment of personal glory, in 1509, when the citizen army that he had finally been allowed to form overcame Pisan resistance and took the town after a long siege. Given the many failed attempts to capture Pisa using mercenary armies, this victory was a powerful vindication of Machiavelli's conviction that citizen armies were superior. It was also the only occasion in his 14 years of service when Soderini took the initiative with success. But in every other respect things went from bad to worse. Florence was living on borrowed time, its freedom dependent on the whims of others. 3 years after the capture of Pisa, when Pope Julius, now in alliance with the Spanish, defeated the French at Ravenna, he immediately sent an army to Florence to impose a return of the Medici and transform the city into a puppet state dependent on Rome. After brief resistance, the Florentine army was crushed at Prato, a few miles to the north of the city. Soderini escaped and the Medici returned. Machiavelli was unemployed and unemployable. The scandalous nature of the prince was largely determined by its structure, rather than any conscious desire to shock. Originally entitled On Principalities, the book opens with an attempt to categorize different kinds of states and governments at different moments of their development, then, moving back and forth between ancient and modern history, to establish some universal principles relative to the business of taking and holding power in each kind of state. Given Machiavelli's experience, wide reading, and determined intellectual honesty, the project obliged him to explain that there were many occasions when winning and holding political power was possible only if a leader was ready to act outside the moral codes that applied to ordinary individuals. Public opinion was such, he explained, that once victory was achieved, nobody was going to put the winner on trial. Political leaders were above the law. Had Machiavelli insisted on deploring this unhappy state of affairs, had he dwelt on other criteria for judging a leader, aside from his mere ability to stay in power and build a strong state, had he told us with appropriate piety that power was hardly worth having if you had to sell your soul to get it, he could have headed off a great deal of criticism while still delivering the same information. But aside from one or two token regrets that the world is not a nicer place, Machiavelli does not do this. It wasn't his project. Rather, he takes it for granted that we already know that life, particularly political life, is routinely, and sometimes unspeakably, cruel, and that once established in a position of power, a ruler may have no choice but to kill or be killed. This is where the words of necessity, must and have to, become so ominous. For the prince is most convincing and most scandalous not in its famous general statements, that the end justifies the means, that men must be pampered or crushed, that the only sure way of keeping a conquered territory is to devastate it utterly, and so on. But in the many historical examples of barbarous behavior that Machiavelli puts before us, without any hand-wringing, as things that were bound to happen, the Venetians find that their mercenary leader Carmignola is not putting much effort into his fighting anymore. But they are afraid that if they dismiss him, he will walk off with the territory he previously captured for them, at which point the only safe thing to do was to kill him. Caro of Syracuse, when given command of his country's army, finds that they are all mercenaries, and realizing that they could neither make use of them nor let them go, he had them all cut to pieces. The climax of this approach comes with Machiavelli's presentation of the ruthless Cesare Borgia as a model for any man determined to win a state for himself, as if such a project were not essentially dissimilar from building a house or starting a business. Having tamed and unified the Romagna with the help of his cruel minister Ramiro de Orco, Machiavelli tells us, Borgia decided to deflect people's hatred away from himself by putting the blame for all atrocities on his minister and then doing away with him, so he had de Orco beheaded and his corpse put on display one morning in the piazza in Cesena, with a wooden block and a bloody knife beside. The ferocity of the spectacle left people both gratified and shocked. It's hard not to feel as we read the chapters on Borgia that this is the point where Machiavelli's book ceases to be the learned but fairly tame on principalities and is transformed into the extraordinary and disturbing work that would eventually be called The Prince. In short, Machiavelli's attention has shifted from a methodical analysis of different political systems to a gripping and personally engaged account of the psychology of the leader who has placed himself beyond constrictions of Christian ethics and lives in a delirium of pure power. A diplomat like Machiavelli, who had spent his life among the powerful but never really held the knife by the handle, a state employee so scrupulously honest that when investigated for embezzlement he ended up being reimbursed monies that were due to him. It was all too easy to fall into a state of envy and almost longing when contemplating the awesome Borgia, who had no qualms about taking anything that came his way and never dreamed of being honest to anyone. At a deep level, then, the scandal of the prince is intimately tied up with the scandal of all writers of fiction and history, who in the quiet of their studies take vicarious enjoyment in the ruthlessness of the characters they describe. But with this difference, Machiavelli systematizes such behavior and appears to recommend it, if only to those few who are committed to winning and holding political power. The author's description, in a letter to a friend, of his state of mind when writing the book, makes it clear what a relief it was, during these months immediately following his dismissal, imprisonment, and torture, to imagine himself back in the world of politics, and if only on paper, on a par with history's great heroes. Come evening, I walk home and go into my study. In the passage, I take off my ordinary clothes, caked with mud and slime, and put on my formal palace gowns. Then, when I'm properly dressed, I take my place in the courts of the past, where the ancients welcome me kindly, and I eat my fill of the only food that is really mine and that I was born for. I'm quite at from power, his arrest, imprisonment, and death, almost as if the author were in denial about his hero's ultimate fallibility. Therapeutic as this might have been, however, at another level the Prince was clearly written for publication and meant as a public performance. Machiavelli loves to show off his intelligence, his range of reference, his clever reasoning. Even here, though, his intentions were divided and perhaps contradictory. At his most passionate and focused, he was involved in a debate with all the great historians and philosophers of the past, and determined to show his contemporaries that his own mind was as sharp as the best. But in a more practical mood, Machiavelli was planning to use the book as a passport to get himself back into a job, so evident and compelling, he hoped, would his analytical skills appear, that the ruler to whom he formally gave and dedicated the book would necessarily want to employ him, hence the flattering tone of the opening dedication and the addition of the prince's final patriotic pages, proposing that the ruler in question should be the man to rid Italy of foreign oppression. Who was this ruler? Shortly before Machiavelli had been released from prison, Pope Julius had died and been replaced by Giovanni de' Medici, Il Magnifico's son, the man who had become a cardinal at 13. This was March 1513. When he started work on the prince some months later, Machiavelli had intended to dedicate the book to Giovanni's brother, Giuliano, who had been put in charge of Florence after the Medici's return. However, when the effeminate Giuliano began to move away from politics and was replaced in Florence by his aggressive, warlike nephew Lorenzo, Machiavelli decided to switch the dedication to the younger man. Thus far, the writer showed himself flexible in the face of changing events. Yet there is something ingenuous and almost endearing in the clever diplomat's miscalculation here. The brilliant reasoning required to convince yourself that you had got a grip on politics and history. The profound analysis that would demonstrate to your fellow intellectuals that you were as clear-headed as Livy, Tacitus, and Thucydides put together, were not the qualities that a young and hardly well-read Medici prince was likely to comprehend. Never mind enjoy. Given the book in 1515, Lorenzo probably never opened it, and certainly didn't take time to study Machiavelli's carefully crafted reflections. Then, even if he had read it, would Lorenzo, or indeed any other ruler, have wanted to employ a diplomat who had gone on record as saying that trickery was largely the name of the game, and that though it wasn't important to have a religious faith, it was absolutely essential to appear to have one? Machiavelli should have been the first to understand that, as an instrument for furthering his diplomatic career, rather than a literary and philosophical achievement in its own right, the book's honesty would be self-defeating. The two goals were never compatible. Surprised and disappointed by the prince's failure, Machiavelli went back to womanizing. Aside from routine whoring, he fell in and out of love easily, pursuing passion without discretion or restraint. And just as he had more luck with romance than diplomacy, he had more success when he wrote ironic, sex-centered comedies rather than candid but dangerous political analyses. In 1518, the first performance of his play The Mandrake Root, in which a young man invents the most absurd subterfuges to get a married woman into bed, won Machiavelli immediate celebrity. Some years later, Clizia, which this time has an older man hell-bent on having his way with a very young woman, confirmed his talent. But literary success was not enough for Machiavelli. It was active politics that interested him, and, though he labored for 10 years or so on his discourses on Livy, then on a long history of Florence, and finally on a short work entitled The Art of War. It was his old job as the city's principal ambassador that he always yearned for. Finally, in 1525, Pope Clement VII, alias Giulio de' Medici, Giovanni's cousin, drew the ex-diplomat back into politics, asking him for advice on how to deal with the growing antagonism between the French and the Spanish. As an eventual clash between the two great powers inside Italy loomed ever closer, Machiavelli was given the task of overseeing Florence's defensive walls. When the crunch came, however, and the armies of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, now united under the same crown, marched south into Italy, they simply bypassed Florence, went straight to Rome, and sacked it. It was an occasion of the most disgraceful savagery on a scale Italy had not witnessed for centuries. In the aftermath, the Medici regime in Florence collapsed, and once again Machiavelli was out of favor. Overwhelmed with disappointment, and in the habit of taking medicines that weren't good for him, he died in June 1527, aged 58, having accepted, no doubt after careful calculation, extreme unction. That there are many different roads to notoriety, and that a man's achievements may combine with historical events in unexpected ways, are truths Machiavelli was well aware of. So he would have appreciated the irony that it was largely due to Luther's Protestant reform and the ensuing wars of religion that his name became the object of the most implacable vilification, and, as a consequence, universally famous. The turning point came in 1572. The Prince had not been published in Machiavelli's lifetime. After circulating for years in manuscript form, then in a printed Latin edition still entitled On Principalities, it finally appeared in Italian in 1532, only to be put on Pope Paul IV's Index of Prohibited Books in 1559, this partly in response to the prompting of the English Cardinal Reginald Pole, who maintained that, written as it was by Satan's finger, the prince was largely responsible for Henry VIII's decision to take the English Church away from Rome. Meantime, in France, the conflict between the Protestant Huguenots and the Catholics was intensifying and would reach a head under the reign of the sickly young Charles IX, who for the most part was controlled by his mother, the Italian, indeed Florentine, Catherine de' Medici, daughter of the same Lorenzo de' Medici to whom Machiavelli had dedicated the prince. Catherine had brought a great many Italian favorites into the French court, a move guaranteed to arouse anti-Italian feeling. In general, she sought to dampen down the religious conflict, which threatened to tear France apart, but nevertheless she would be held responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were murdered. One potential victim, innocent Gentillet, escaped to Protestant Geneva and wrote a discourse contre Machiavel that was to set the tone for anti-Machiavellian criticism for decades to come. Intended as an attack on Catherine de' Medici and militant French Catholicism, and hence a defense of the Huguenots, the book described Catherine as a compulsive reader of Machiavelli and, playing on anti-Italian feeling, claimed that both queen and writer were representative of a callous and villainous trait in Italian national character. Listed out of context, the ideas developed in The Prince were schematized and simplified, allowing readers to imagine they had read Machiavelli himself when what they were actually getting was a travesty that legitimized any form of brutality and rejoiced in amoral calculation. From this point on, Machiavelli's name escaped from the restricted circle of intellectual reflection and became a popular term of denigration. Mach-evil and Machiavellian were typical English corruptions. Mitchell Wiley is Scottish. Many critics would not bother reading his work in the original, but take their information from Gentillet, whose Anti-Machiavel, as his book became known, was quickly translated into Latin for English readers and then, some 20 years later, directly into English. At this point, the end of the 16th century, the first English translation of Machiavelli's work was yet to appear. Ironically, in the years after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, as Catherine de' Medici struggled to find some solution to France's civil wars, and in particular, to convince Catholics of the need to tolerate the existence of the Huguenots, if only in Huguenot enclaves, both she and her supposed mentor Machiavelli once again came under attack, this time from the Catholic side. The accusation now was that, in the attempt to avoid conflict, religious truths of supreme importance were being subordinated to questions of political convenience, something that would eventually transform France, the Catholics feared, into a secular state. Here the criticism comes, closer to the real spirit of Machiavelli. Renaissance humanism in general had shifted the focus of intellectual reflection from questions of theology and metaphysical truth to matters of immediate and practical human interest. In general, however, lip service had always been paid to the ultimate superiority of religious matters, and writers had avoided suggesting that there might be a profound incompatibility between rival value systems. It was perfectly possible, that is, to be a good Christian and an effective political leader. Machiavelli, on the contrary, made it clear that, as he saw it, Christian principles and effective political leadership were not always compatible. Situations would arise where one was bound to choose between the two. It was not, as his critics claimed, that he rejected all ethical values outright. The strength, unity, and independence of a people and state certainly constituted goals worth fighting for. "I love my country more than my soul," Machiavelli declared in a letter to fellow historian Francesco Guicciardini. But such goals could not always be achieved without abandoning Christian principles. Two value systems were at loggerheads. To make matters worse, Machiavelli did not appear to be concerned about this. He took it as an evident truth. Christian principles were admirable, but not applicable for politicians in certain circumstances. The idea that all human behavior could be assessed in relation to one set of values was naive and utopian. It was insofar as Machiavelli allowed these dangerous implications to surface in his writing that he both unmasked and himself became identified with what we might call the unacceptable face of Renaissance humanism. How much the presentation of the Machiavellian villain in Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, from Cade and Marlowe, through to Middleton, Shakespeare, and ultimately Ben Jonson, owed to Gentile's anti-Machiavel, and how much to a direct knowledge of Machiavelli's writings is still a matter of academic dispute. In the 1580s, an Italian version of The Prince was printed in England, avoiding a publication ban by claiming falsely on the frontispiece that it was printed in Italy. Many educated English people at the time had a good knowledge of Italian. Sir Francis Bacon had certainly read The Prince before its first legal publication in English in 1640, defending the Florentine in the advancement of learning. 1605, with the remark, "We are much beholden to Machiavel and others that write what men do and not what they ought to do." But the murderous Machiavel, who gets more than 400 mentions in Elizabethan drama, thus making the Florentines' name synonymous with the idea of villainy for centuries to come, is another matter. The Roman author Seneca had long ago established a tradition in tragic drama that featured an evil, calculating tyrant who would stop at nothing to grasp all the power he could. Renaissance Italian theater had updated this type of villain with elements from Machiavelli, transforming the character into an unscrupulous courtier who takes pleasure in wicked calculation and cruelty. It was from this model that the English theater developed its endless manifestations of the devious rogue, pander, miser, or revengeful cuckold, who administers poisons with aplomb and is never without a dagger beneath his cloak. From the point of view of the dramatist, an unscrupulous character who has a secret agenda and relies on his presumed intellectual superiority to dupe those around him is obviously an exciting proposition. Such a figure can be depended upon to create tension, keep the plot moving, and allow for resolutions where the larger group's benign order once again imposes itself after the tragic disturbance caused by the wicked, scheming individual. Beyond a superficial repulsion that the audience feels towards such a character, be it Marlowe's Jew of Malta, Webster's Flaminio and the White Devil, or Shakespeare's Iago, there is also an undercurrent of excitement at the thought that it might be possible to take life entirely into one's hands, manipulate people and circumstances at will, and generally pursue one's selfish goals without a thought for moral codes or eternal damnation. In this sense, the Machiavellian villain looks ahead to the worst of modern individualism. Then there was also, of course, the contrasting pleasure of seeing the clever schemer hoist with his own petard. As the years passed and the high tension of Jacobean tragedy relaxed into the comedies of Ben Jonson and his contemporaries, the evil Machiavel became a pathetic failure, whose complacently wicked designs inevitably and reassuringly led to his making a fool of himself. Fading out of British drama in the mid-17th century, this stock figure is still resurrected from time to time, most recently and hilariously in Rowan Atkinson's Blackadder, a character who adds a visceral cowardice to the already long list of Machiavel's vices. To a great extent, no doubt, it was this identification of Machiavelli's name with everything that was evil which kept the prince in print and guaranteed that despite the papal ban, it would be widely read. But there was more. As medieval Christianity and scholasticism sank into the past, and science and reason made their slow, often unwelcome advances, as Europe got used to religious schism and competing versions of the truth, the overriding question for any modern ruler inevitably became, how can I convince people that I have a legitimate, reasonable right to hold power and to govern? In England, Charles Stuart would insist on the notion that kings had a divine right, this at a time when so many English monarchs had seized their crowns by force and cunning. Curiously enough, Charles's great antagonist Cromwell felt that he too had a direct line to God and legitimacy, but through belief and piety rather than family and inheritance. Officially a parliamentarian, Cromwell frequently governed without parliament or elections for fear the people might not see things God's way. Meantime, across Europe, the princes and princesses of ancient noble families took to marrying and remarrying each other in an ever-thickening web of defensive alliances, as if density of blood and lineage might offer protection against the threat of usurpers, or worse still, republicanism and democracy. No family was more practiced at this upmarket dating game than the Medici, who, partly thanks to an extraordinary network of connections, would hang on in Florence in a client-state twilight lasting more than 200 undistinguished years. Meantime, from Paris to Madrid to Naples, the court clothes became finer, the statues and monuments more pompous, and the whole royal charade more colorful and more solemn, as though people might somehow be dazzled into believing that a king or a duke really did have a right to rule. Many prestigious works of art were commissioned with precisely this idea in mind, but most of all Europe's rulers worked hard to put a halo round their crowned heads, to appear religious and at all costs to uphold the faith, sensing that this too would bolster their position and draw attention away from the mystery of their privileges. Later still, particularly after the French Revolution had destroyed any illusions about the rights of monarchs, the rather desperate card of respectability was played. Members of court, Napoleon ordered, shortly after usurping power, must attend soirees with their wives to appear respectable and avoid gossip. The death of conversation, Talleyrand opined. Certainly when a leader has to rely on appearing respectable to claim legitimacy, he is on thin ice indeed. To this long-drawn-out conspiracy of pomp and pious circumstance, Machiavelli's little book was a constant threat. It reminded people that power is always up for grabs, always a question of what can be taken by force or treachery, and always, despite all protests to the contrary, the prime concern of any ruler. In their attempt to discredit the prince, both religious and state authorities played up the author's admiration for the ruthless Borgia, and never mentioned his perception that in the long run a ruler must avoid being hated by his people, and must always put their interests before those of the aristocracy. The people are so many, Machiavelli reflected, that power ultimately lies with them. Liberal and left-wing thinkers were not slow to pick up on this aspect of the book. As Rousseau saw it, the whole of The Prince was itself a Machiavellian ruse. The author had only pretended to give lessons to kings, whereas in fact his real aim was to teach people to be free, by showing them that royal power was no more than subterfuge. Both Spinoza and, later, the Italian poet Ugo Foscolo saw it the same way. The Prince was a cautionary tale about how power really worked, the underlying intention being to deprive those who held it of dignity and glamour and teach the people as a whole how to resist it. Machiavelli, after all, declared himself a Republican and a Libertarian. The communist leader Antonio Gramsci would even see the prince as looking forward to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Others took a more traditional view. Bertrand Russell described the prince as a handbook for gangsters, and in so doing did no more than repeat the position of Frederick the Great, who wrote a book to refute Machiavelli and present a more idealistic vision of monarchical government. Others again, Jacob Burckhardt and Friedrich Meinecke, found a space between denigration and admiration to suggest that the novelty of Machiavelli was to present leadership and nation-building as creative processes that should be judged not morally but aesthetically. In a manner that looked forward to Nietzsche, the charismatic leader made a work of art of himself and his government. Mussolini simply took the book at face value. It was a useful vade-mecum for statesmen, he enthused. But whatever our interpretation of his intentions, one reaction that Machiavelli never seems to provoke is indifference. Reading The Prince, it is impossible not to engage with the disturbing notion that politics cannot be governed by the ethical codes that most of us seek to observe in our ordinary lives. And however we react to this idea, once we have closed the book, it will be very hard to go on thinking of our own leaders in quite the same way as we did before. Translator's note. Translations have a way of gathering dust. This isn't true of an original text. When we read Chaucer or Shakespeare, we may need a gloss, or in the case of Chaucer, a modern translation. But we only look at these things so that we can then enjoy the work as it was first written, and we're struck by its immediacy and freshness, as if we had been able to learn a foreign language in a very short space of time with little effort and maximum reward. This is not the case with an old translation. If we read Pope's translation of Homer today, we read it because we want to read Pope, not Homer. Linguistically, the translation draws our attention more to the language and poetry of our 18th century than to Homer or ancient Greece. So to attempt a new translation of Machiavelli is not to dismiss previous translations as poor. We are just acknowledging that these older versions now draw attention to themselves as moments in the English language. My efforts, of course, will someday meet the same fate. Such distractions are particularly unfortunate with Machiavelli, who insisted that he was only interested in style insofar as it could deliver content without frills or distraction. I haven't prettified the book, he tells us, or padded it out with long sentences or pompous, pretentious words, or any of the irrelevant flourishes and attractions so many writers use. I didn't want it to please for anything but the range and seriousness of its subject matter. I have taken that statement of intention as my guide in this translation, attempting wherever possible to free the text from the archaisms and corrosive quaintness of older English versions, to get to the essential meaning of the original and deliver it, as we say today, but perhaps not tomorrow, straight. It isn't easy. The first problem, and one that sets up all the others, is already there in the title, the prince. What is a prince for Machiavelli? Well, a duke is a prince. The Pope is a prince. A Roman emperor is a prince. The King of France is a prince. The Lord of Imola is a prince. This won't work in modern English. The English have Prince Charles. And the thing about Prince Charles is that he is not King Charles and probably never will be. And even if he were king, he would wield no real power, not even the kind of power the Pope wields, and we never think of the Pope as a king or prince. The only other idea we have of the prince, in English, is Prince Charming. This concept is a long way from the aging Prince Charles, and even further from the kind of prince Machiavelli was talking about. Machiavelli's word prince does not mean the son of the king, and even less an attractive young suitor. Machiavelli's principe refers generically to men of power, men who rule a state. The prince is the first or principal man, so the translator is tempted to use the word king. At least in the past, a king stood at the apex of a hierarchical system. He was the man who mattered. But it is difficult, translating Machiavelli, to use the word king to refer to the Lord of Imola, or a pope, or a Roman emperor. In the end, as far as possible, I have resolved this problem by using the rather unattractive word ruler, or even the more generic leader, though always making it clear that we're talking about the political leader of a state. The book's famous title, however, must be left as it is. Even harder to solve is the translation of virtue, together with a number of other words that cluster around it. It would be so easy to write the English cognate virtue, meaning the opposite of vice, but this is not what Machiavelli was talking about. He was not interested in the polarity good-evil, but in winning and losing, strength and weakness, success and failure. For Machiavelli, virtue was any quality of character that enabled you to take political power or to hold on to it. In short, a winning trait. It could be courage in battle, or strength of personality, or political cunning, or it might even be the kind of ruthless cruelty that lets your subjects know you mean business. But one can hardly write cunning or cruelty for virtue, even if one knows that in this context that is what the text means, because then you would lose the sense that, although Machiavelli is not talking about the moral virtues, he nevertheless wants to give a positive connotation to the particular qualities he is talking about. This cruelty is aimed at solving problems, retaining power, keeping a state strong. Hence, in this context, it is a virtue. Ugly though it may sound, then, I have sometimes been obliged to translate virtue as positive qualities or strength of character, except of course on those occasions, because there are some, when Machiavelli does mean virtues in the moral sense, in which case he's usually talking about the importance of faking them, even if you may not have them. Faking, of course, when cunningly deployed for an appropriate end, is another important virtue. The spin doctor was not a notion invented in the 1990s. Related to both these particular problems, Prince virtue is the more general difficulty that so many of the key words Machiavelli uses have English cognates through Latin: fortuna, audax, circumspetto, malignita, diligente, etc. In some cases they are true cognates, prudente, prudent, for example, but even then to use the cognate pulls us back to a rather dusty, archaic style. Aren't the words careful or cautious or considered more often used now than the word prudent? Something of the same difficulty can occur where there is no cognate in English, but a traditional and consolidated dictionary equivalent for an old Italian term. Machiavelli frequently uses the word savio, which has usually been translated wise, but again this invites the English version to drift towards that slightly stilted archaic style so often used to render great texts from the past sensible or on other occasions shrewd, are choices that, depending on the context, can combine accuracy with a prose that draws less attention to itself as a translation. So the constantly recurring question as one translates the Prince is, what words would we use today to describe the qualities and situations Machiavelli is talking about? Of course, sometimes there are no modern words, because there are certain things, siege engines, cavalry attacks, that we don't talk about anymore. On the whole, though, Machiavelli is chiefly interested in psychology, or rather, in the interaction of different personalities in crisis situations, and here, so long as the translator avoids the temptation to introduce misleading contemporary jargon, a great deal can be done to get the Prince into clear contemporary English. However, the difficulty of these lexical choices is infinitely compounded by Machiavelli's wayward grammar and extremely flexible syntax. Written in 1513, the Prince is not easily comprehensible to Italians today. Recent editions of the work are usually parallel texts, with the modern Italian translation printed beside the original. The obstacle for the Italian reader, however, is hardly lexical at all. In the end, he can understand a good 90% of the words Machiavelli is using. Rather, it has to do with a combination of extreme compression of thought, obsolete, sometimes erratic grammar, and, above all, a syntax where subordinate and pre-modifying clauses abound in ways that the modern reader is not used to. We are not talking here about those complex but always elegant Ciceronian sentences so admired and frequently mimicked by the English Augustans. Machiavelli has a more spoken, flexible, persuading, sometimes brusque voice, and to get that tone in English one has to opt for a syntax that is quite different from the original Italian. In particular, the sequence with which information is delivered within the sentence frequently has to be reorganized. Here, to give the reader a sense of what he can expect, are three versions of the same paragraph, the last being my own. I haven't chosen anything especially complex. It's a fairly ordinary passage in which, as so often, Machiavelli poses a situation, then considers possible responses to it, and the consequences of each response. The first translation is from W.K. Marriott and was published in 1908. A prince is also respected when he's either a true friend or a downright enemy, that is to say, when without any reservation he declares himself in favor of one party against the other, which course will always be more advantageous than standing neutral. Because if two of your powerful neighbors come to blows, they are of such a character that, if one of them conquers, you have either to fear him or not. In either case, it will always be more advantageous for you to declare yourself and to make war strenuously, because in the first case, if you do not declare yourself, you will invariably fall a prey to the conqueror, to the pleasure and satisfaction of him who has been conquered, and you will have no reasons to offer, nor anything to protect or to shelter you, because he who conquers does not want doubtful friends who will not aid him in the time of trial, and he who loses will not harbor you because you did not willingly, sword in hand, court his fate. The second is from George Bull, published in 1961. A prince also wins prestige for being a true friend or a true enemy, that is, for revealing himself without any reservation in favor of one side against another. This policy is always more advantageous than neutrality. For instance, if the powers neighboring on you come to blows, either they are such that, if one of them conquers, you will be in danger, or they are not. In either case, it will always be to your advantage to declare yourself and to wage a vigorous war, because, in the first case, if you do not declare yourself, you will always be at the mercy of the conqueror, much to the pleasure and satisfaction of the one who has been beaten, and you will have no justification nor any way to obtain protection or refuge. The conqueror does not want doubtful friends who do not help him when he is in difficulties. The loser repudiates you because you were unwilling to go, arms in hand, and throw in your lot with him. And here is my own. A ruler will also be respected when he is a genuine friend and a genuine enemy, that is, when he declares himself unambiguously for one side and against the other. This policy will always bring better results than neutrality. For example, if you have two powerful neighbors who go to war, you may or may not have reason to fear the winner afterwards. Either way, it will always be better to take sides and fight hard. If you do have cause to fear but stay neutral, you'll still be gobbled up by the winner to the amusement and satisfaction of the loser. You'll have no excuses, no defense, and nowhere to hide. Because a winner doesn't want half-hearted friends who don't help him in a crisis, and the loser will have nothing to do with you, since you didn't choose to fight alongside him and share his fate. A typically tricky moment in this passage comes when Machiavelli says of these neighboring powers, O sono di quelli tace, vincendo uno di quelli, tu abbia a temere del vincitore o no. Literally, either they are of qualities that winning one of those, you ought to fear the winner or not. Here Marriott gives, they are of such a character that if one of them conquers, you have either to fear him or not. And Bull, either they are such that, if one of them conquers, you will be in danger or they are not. Here it's clear that Bull is closer to modern prose, yet one still feels that nobody writing down this idea today in English would introduce the second part of Machiavelli's alternative as Bull does by tagging that, or they are not, onto the end of the sentence after the introduction of an if clause. If we follow Bull's general structure but move the alternative forward thus, either they are or they aren't such that if one of them conquers you will be in danger, the sentence gains in fluency. In the end, however, the simplest solution seemed to me to shift the alternative aspect towards the verb fear and away from a description of the two states. This leaves the sense of the sentence intact and allows us to get closer to the original's telegraphic delivery. You may or may not have reason to fear the winner afterwards. Let me say at this point that I have the greatest respect for both these earlier translations and indeed various others. I owe a lot to them because, although I have always translated directly from the original, I have then gone to these and to the modern Italian translations to see where they disagree and to mull over what I can learn from them. The original text is such that, on occasion, all four of the translations I have been looking at, 2 English and 2 Italian, offer different interpretations. In these cases, one really must attune oneself to Machiavelli's mental processes, his insistence on logic, reason, and deduction, and remember that every clause, if not every word, is there for a purpose. Here is a small example. Having stated that rulers must at all costs avoid being hated by their subjects, and that such hatred is almost always the cause of a leader's downfall, Machiavelli foresees that some people will object that this wasn't the case with many Roman emperors who either held on to power despite being hated by the people, or lost it despite being loved. To meet these objections, he tells us, I shall consider the qualities of some of these emperors, showing how the causes of their downfall are not at all out of line with my reasoning above. So far so good, but this sentence then ends. I parte mettero in considerazione quelle cose che sono notabili a chi legge le azioni di quelli tempi. Translating word for word, this gives. In part I will put in consideration those things that are important to people who read the events of those times. What is this about? Why did Machiavelli feel the need to add these words to a sentence that already seems clear enough? Bull offers, I shall submit for consideration examples which are well known to students of the period. This may sound sensible and vaguely academic, but it simply is inaccurate. The word parte has gone. To submit for consideration may be a standard English formula, but does it mean the same as Machiavelli's actually rather unusual put in consideration? Notable doesn't so much mean well known as worthy of note or important. Marriott gives, at the same time I will only submit for consideration those things that are noteworthy to him who studies the affairs of those times. Again, we have the standard, submit for consideration, while at the same time and only are both translators' additions. It now sounds as if Machiavelli is reassuring us that he will only look at examples that are relevant, but this sort of defensiveness is not the author's way. Why would the reader have suspected him of introducing irrelevant examples? One modern Italian translation gives, in parte indicero che fatiche sono importanti per chi si interessa alla storia di quei tempi. Literally, and in part I will indicate those facts that are important for people interested in the history of those times. This is now extremely close to our literal translation of Machiavelli's original, but still not particularly helpful. What is the author getting at? What does the phrase add to what has already been said? Another Italian translation gives, nello stesso tempo indicherò I fatti che devono essere messi in evidenza da chi si interessa alla storia di quei tempi. Literally, at the same time I will indicate the facts that must be put in evidence by people interested in the history of those times. Despite the fact that parte has once again been mysteriously transformed into at the same time, a classic filler when a translator is lost, an idea at last emerges that there are facts that people interested in those times must put in evidence, and the implication is that without these facts, we won't understand what has to be understood if we are to be persuaded by the author's argument. At this point, the translator tries to enter Machiavelli's reasoning, reassured by the knowledge that here we have an author who always puts sense and clarity before anything else. Machiavelli, remember, is facing objections from people who claim that the question of whether a ruler's people do or do not hate him is not the crucial criterion when it comes to considering whether that leader will survive. Those objections, what's more, are based on the lives of certain Roman emperors. What Machiavelli is going to show in the following paragraphs is that the nature of power and political institutions in the Roman Empire was profoundly different from that in a modern, early 16th century state, the key difference being the existence in Roman times of a strong standing army that, for safety's sake, a leader had to satisfy before satisfying the people, and that could often only be kept happy by allowing it to treat the people very harshly, stealing and raping at will. This little clause appears to be doing then. What this little clause appears to be doing then is preparing us for Machiavelli's approach to answering the objection that has been raised. It is a question, he is going to tell us, of understanding a different historical context. The word parte could be short for a parte, apart, separately, or in parte, in part, as both the Italian translations take it. Now perhaps we can read the sentence as a whole thus. To meet these objections, I shall consider the qualities of some of these emperors, showing how the causes of their downfall are not at all out of line with my reasoning above, and bringing into the argument some of the context that historians of the period consider important. The original matter in considerazione, put in consideration, is used only once in the whole of the Prince. Having the text in electronic form is a huge help to the translator, hence the decision not to translate with a standard formula such as submit for consideration, but to give a more precise sense to the words with the expression bringing into the argument. Machiavelli is advising us that for these particular examples he will have to fill in a different context. The idea of parte I have understood as in part, and then for the sake of fluency rendered it with some. The author can't bring in all the context, but some of it. One has no way of knowing whether this is exactly what Machiavelli meant, but the sentence now gives an internal cohesion to the passage that was lacking in other versions. And if we return to our word-for-word translation of the original, in part I will put in consideration those things that are important to people who read the events of those times, we see that it can indeed be read in the way we have chosen to render it. One particularly pernicious problem a translator faces as he grapples with the Prince is the book's reputation. Machiavelli is a scandal, every schoolboy knows, because he puts the ends before the means to the point of condoning acts of violence, cruelty, and betrayal, something Christian and modern Western ethics consider unacceptable. We don't condone a brutal killing just because it puts an end to a riot, and we are no longer at ease with the idea of torture, even when it might prevent a terrorist atrocity. The climax of this scandal comes with the author's discussion of Cesare Borgia, a man who rose to power and kept it with the use of extraordinary treachery and cruelty. The temptation for the translator is to play to the reputation of the book, underlining Machiavelli's extreme views and making sure the text doesn't disappoint, even when its tone and subtlety are not perhaps exactly what readers were expecting. At the end of the discussion of Borgia, having recounted how he eventually lost power when his father, Pope Alexander, suddenly and unexpectedly died and a pope hostile to Borgia was elected, Machiavelli writes, "Having gathered then all the actions of the Duke, I would not know how to reproach him." Bull gives, "So having summed up all that the Duke did, I cannot possibly censure him." Here the word censure has a strong moral connotation, and the statement is made stronger still by the introduction of can't possibly, which seems a heavy interpretation of the standard Italian formula, I wouldn't know how to. In Bull's version, it seems that Machiavelli is making a point of telling us that he has no moral objections to anything Cesare Borgia did, this in line with the author's reputation for cynicism. Marriott more cautiously gives, "When all the actions of the Duke are recalled, I do not know how to blame him. and both Italian translations take the same line. The fact is that just as the word virtue is rarely used in a strictly moral context, so the word reprendere, reproach, refers not to moral behavior, but to the question, did the Duke get something wrong? Did he make a mistake? A key to reading the word comes at the opening to the next paragraph, where we have solamente si può accusarlo nella creazione di Giulio Pontefice, nella quale lui ebbe mala elezione, which more or less literally gives us, the only thing Borgia can be accused of is his role in the election of Pope Julius, where he made a bad choice. That is, as far as his own interests were concerned, he backed the wrong man. Here we approach the subtler scandal of Machiavelli's text. It is not that the author is insisting that Borgia's immoral acts should not be censured, rather that Machiavelli is just not interested in discussing the moral aspect of the question at all, or not from a Christian point of view. For him it is a case of shrewd or mistaken choices, not of good or evil. When he proposes Borgia as a model, neither morality nor immorality come into it, only the fact that this man knew how to win power and hold it, and build a strong state. Finally, one can't help noticing a certain Victorian bashfulness in previous translations. Machiavelli was a notorious womanizer, and in writing The Prince he believed he was addressing an audience of men who had no worries about political correctness. When he says fortune is woman and it is necessary, wanting to keep her underneath, to beat her and shove her, there is an obvious sexual reference. Machiavelli wants to go out on a strong but, as he no doubt saw it, witty note. Here is Marriott's version of the whole last paragraph. I conclude, therefore, that fortune being changeful and mankind steadfast in their ways, so long as the two are in agreement, men are successful, but unsuccessful when they fall out. For my part, I consider that it is better to be adventurous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill-use her, and it is seen that she allows herself to be mastered by the adventurous rather than by those who go to work more coldly. She is, therefore, always womanlike, a lover of young men, because they are less cautious, more violent, and with more audacity command her, and bulls. I conclude, therefore, that as fortune is changeable, whereas men are obstinate in their ways, men prosper so long as fortune and policy are in accord, and where there is a clash they fail. I hold strongly to this, that it is better to be impetuous than circumspect, because fortune is a woman, and if she is to be submissive, it is necessary to beat and coerce her. Experience shows that she is more often subdued by men who do this than by those who act coldly. Always, being a woman, she favors young men, because they are less circumspect and more ardent, and because they command her with greater audacity. I hope I am getting closer to the spirit of the thing, and for better or worse, the kind of man Machiavelli was, offering this. To conclude then, fortune varies, but men go on regardless. When their approach suits the times, they're successful, and when it doesn't, they're not. My opinion on the matter is this: it's better to be impulsive than cautious. Fortune is female, and if you want to stay on top of her, you have to slap and thrust. You'll see she's more likely to yield that way than to men who go about her coldly. And being a woman, she likes her men young, because they're not so cagey. They're wilder and more daring when they master her.